So now we're going to talk about the 19th century, which we talked about in one of our last lectures, the architecture of the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century. And may have seemed a little bit out of place, but the 19th century was also a period of a lot of architectural revivals, bringing back old styles of architecture. And the reason why we talked about the Industrial Revolution first is because even when architects and designers were reviving ancient styles or medieval styles of architecture, they tended to incorporate the modern technologies of cast iron and other building materials and technologies into those revival styles. So they were putting on a sort of a facade, but inside often was a modern, structure and modern building. And a great example, and we'll talk about this, is Westminster Palace, or Parliament, English Parliament building, which looks like a massive English medieval complex, but in fact is largely built out of cast iron. Structurally speaking, it's all cast iron. So it's kind of an interesting transition. But it also represents an era of reaction to some of this industrial architecture. And we talked about that a little bit, about how the public did not want to see major public buildings looking like industrial buildings. That was okay for a World's Fair that was showcasing industry, like the Crystal Palace or like the Paris Exposition. But real building, quote, real buildings ought to look like something more architecturally refined. And so we see a lot of experimenting in the century of different revivals of previous. And the first one I want to talk about is the Greek revival. And it kind of will play into early American architecture, as we'll see. But we're going to start with a British example. It really sort of has its origins in England, and one of the best examples is the British Museum in London. This was started in 1825. It was added on and expanded, and largely finished in 1857. The primary architect was Sir Robert Smirke. And here is a view of that. This is of the front of the building. You can see it has get a pointer. It has a central pavilion and then two sort of wings that stick out. But especially in the central pavilion, this is meant to really be a replication of a Greek temple. It's not a Greek temple, and that's why we call it a revival. And there are, difficult little nuances to revival styles versus some of the neoclassical that we had been talking about. But if you look at this, we see a very authentic Ionic order sitting on a pedestal of steps, and an Ionic entablature, and even look in the pediment. It is filled with sculpture, just the way the ancient Greeks would have filled their pediments with sculptural work. And so this gets classified as Greek revival because it's really more of a direct attempt to revive an actual Greek temple, similar to the way Jefferson revived an actual Roman temple for the Virginia State House. In this case, we're going Greek with the British Museum. So if we compare, the classic Greek temple complex of the Acropolis that we talked about last fall with the Pantheon, or the Pantheon, the Parthenon. The Parthenon was the Greek version, and the other buildings, the Propylaea and the Erechtheion that's over here on the left. Here is another view of the Erechtheion on the Acropolis. Here is that Ionic order, very much the same that we just saw at the British Museum. Here is, of course, the Parthenon itself, and can't really see it in here, but this pediment was filled with sculpture. Some of that's still tucked away up in there. Here's another, Greek temple that's very intact, the Temple of Ephesus. We talked about this as well, one of the most intact Greek temples. And, not ironically, I suppose, or coincidentally, inside the British Museum houses parts of the Parthenon. The marbles, the frieze from the Parthenon are actually in the British Museum. They were taken by Lord Elgin from Greece and brought back to London. And this museum was built largely to house that collection, as well as the other pieces of antiquity that British archaeologists were bringing back from Egypt and from Greece and in some cases Rome. And in fact, there's even a Greek temple in the Greek Revival Temple of the British Museum. This is a reconstruction of the Nereid Temple in the British Museum. And here we very clearly see the Ionic order in the entablature. Here's the sculpture in the pediment. So they very specifically, tried to create a Greek temple to put a Greek temple in. If we move to the United States, the Greek Revival was really, really influential in the early years of the United States. We kind of move away from the early sort of Roman and Palladian inspired architecture in the first couple of decades, especially under the influence of Thomas Jefferson and Bulfinch and Latrobe, and we move into really a stronger association with ancient Greece. And again, this was on purpose because Americans in those days saw themselves as kind of bringing back the old Greek democracy of ancient Athens. And one of the greatest proponents of this was William Strickland. Here's an image of Strickland with a painting image of his second U.S. bank in Philadelphia. And here is another professional trained architect. He studied under Latrobe, one of those architects to study under Benjamin Latrobe. So we see a continuity of things happening here. He mostly lived in Philadelphia, and then later, as I'll show you, moves to Nashville, Tennessee later in his life. And he is really the person who helps bring and popularize the Greek Revival in the United States. And he starts with this project here, the Second Bank of the United States. This was if you go back to the Hamilton play that we started with the musical rendition of, a lot of that, especially in the second act, is the whole, do we set up a federal bank and all of that Hamilton was proponent. Jefferson was actually against that. And in fact, Hamilton wins out, and this is the second bank, second U.S. bank to be built in Philadelphia. So this, as similar to what we just saw with the British Museum, is a Greek temple. It's an attempt to be really an accurate Greek temple, as accurate as you can be for the fact that it's a bank and not an actual temple itself. But the facade of this portico, is meant to be a very accurate replication, essentially, of the Parthenon, with the fluted Doric columns, the entablature with the triglyphs and metopes. In this case, unlike the British Museum, no sculptures were placed in the pediment, but it is otherwise meant to be a Greek temple front, as accurately portrayed as possible. And then the back of the building, where the actual bank was, is more of just a box to house that. But the idea was you would see the front and you would think of Greek architecture. And here's an old banknote that people would have used as money back in the day, and we see they even put an image of the bank on the note. So, as this got passed around and distributed, people, used money, they would have seen an image of a Greek temple front on there and might have been inspired to say, hey, we should have one of those in our town. And in fact, it got, not necessarily because of this, but this revival style, this Greek revival style, became very, very popular. I'll end here because we're out of time, but we got a little bit of start, so we'll pick up with Strickland's Tennessee State Capitol on Thursday.